There's a kind of silence that settles over forgotten places, the kind that makes you understand something was here before you and will remain long after you leave. Welcome back to Dead Quiet. If you returned after the last video, you know why. Something about those Pennsylvania stories stayed with you. The warehouse worker who found the tunnels, the veterinarian who faced what shouldn't exist, the inherited house that refused to let go. Real horror doesn't announce itself. It waits in the spaces we've stopped looking. Tonight, we stay in Pennsylvania. But this time, the horror isn't discovered by accident. It's investigated, documented, and reported through proper channels, and the system responds by doing nothing. 4 more true accounts from the Commonwealth's oldest corners, an asylum where someone returned 15 months after closure, a farmhouse where the researcher became the researched, a trail where 16 people vanished across 85 years, and a 200-year-old curse that spreads through the act of learning about it. These aren't campfire tales, they're case files, published research, evidence that sits in archives while the danger continues. If you're drawn to stories where the horror isn't what jumps out at you, but what the institutions choose not to see, where the real fear comes from being right and being ignored, then you're in the right place. Like this video, if these accounts resonated. Subscribe to Dead Quiet and turn on notifications, because these stories surface when they need to be told. Pennsylvania is a state built on layers, asylums that sealed their basements, farmhouses with crawl spaces no one checks, trails where the warnings are never strong enough, communities that carry knowledge in silence, and beneath it all, in the sealed facilities, under the floorboards, along the ridge lines, within the belief systems, something persists. Not supernatural, not always. Sometimes it's just human, patient, methodical, waiting for attention to fade. So let everything else fall away. Listen to what 4 teams discovered when they investigated, documented, and reported, and learned that evidence is not the same as justice. Pay attention to what they tried to warn us about, and remember, in the wild, silence is never empty. Ryan Chen wasn't just an urban explorer. He was a documentary photographer working on a project about Pennsylvania's abandoned psychiatric facilities for his MFA thesis. He'd spent 6 months researching Maple Crest Psychiatric Institute through archives and Freedom of Information Act requests before ever setting foot on the property. What he'd found in those documents convinced him that Maple Crest wasn't just another abandoned building. It was a crime scene that had never been properly investigated. The facility had closed in 1993 following a lawsuit settlement that had been sealed by the court. Ryan had obtained partial records through a FOIA appeal that showed patient complaints dating back to 1967, all of them ignored or dismissed by state oversight committees. 43 patients had been transferred to other facilities or released to family in the final 2 years of operation. But Ryan couldn't find death certificates or subsequent medical records for any of them. He assembled a team for the documentation project. Not thrill seekers, professionals. Marcus Williams, a videographer who'd worked on true crime documentaries. Sarah Chen, a former investigative journalist now freelancing. And David Rodriguez, who'd brought ground-penetrating radar equipment because Ryan's research suggested there might be unmarked graves on the property. They entered the facility legally. Ryan had obtained permission from the holding company that owned the property, presenting his work as historical preservation documentation. They had 48 hours of access, full insurance, and a clear plan. Document everything, focus on patient treatment areas, and use the GPR equipment to scan the grounds. The first 3 hours were standard documentation. Ryan photographed the administrative wing, while Sarah recorded environmental details, and David set up exterior scanning grids. Marcus captured everything on video. Then Sarah found the basement access. It wasn't hidden, just locked with a modern padlock that didn't match the facility's closure date. David cut it with bolt cutters, and they descended together, all four of them, Marcus's camera light and their flashlights illuminating the corridor. The cells made Ryan's stomach turn, but they were expected based on his research. What he hadn't expected was the room at the corridor's end, the one with newer locks, cleaner surfaces, and patient files dated within months of closure. Sarah began photographing files methodically. Marcus kept the video rolling. Ryan documented the room layout. David examined the examination table and medical equipment with increasing concern. "These instruments have been maintained," David said quietly, pointing to the scalpel set. "This isn't 30-year-old rust. Someone's been oiling these hinges." They found the second corridor, the sensory deprivation cells, the operating theater with its observation room. And in that observation room, they found the notebooks. Sarah read them aloud while Marcus filmed. Clinical observations spanning decades, documenting procedures that should have stopped in the 1960s, after psychiatric reform laws. But the entries continued through the 70s, 80s, and into the early 90s. The final notebook entry was dated 15 months ago, not 30 years. 15 months. It documented equipment inventory, security patrol schedules, and structural integrity assessments. Someone was maintaining this space. "We need to leave," Sarah said. "Right now, we need to get this to authorities before..." They heard it then, a vehicle engine outside, footsteps on the floor above them. They weren't alone. Ryan made the decision instantly. "David, Sarah, get the files and notebooks. Marcus, keep recording everything. We go out the maintenance exit on the east side, not the way we came in." They moved quickly, each carrying evidence. Ryan led them through the second corridor, through a maintenance tunnel he'd identified in the architectural plans, up a service stairwell that brought them out near the old loading dock. The vehicle, a white van with no markings, was parked at the main entrance. They couldn't see who was inside. They made it to their vehicles without incident, but Ryan's hands shook as he drove away. In his rearview mirror, he saw someone emerge from the building, too far away to identify, just standing there, watching them leave. Ryan didn't wait. He contacted the state attorney general's office that evening with digital copies of everything they'd found. He sent copies to the state police. He sent copies to 3 investigative journalists at major newspapers. The response was slower than he'd expected. The Attorney General's office acknowledged receipt and said they'd review the materials. 2 weeks passed. Ryan called daily. He was told the investigation was ongoing. The journalists were more responsive. One of them, a reporter named Jennifer Martinez at the Philadelphia Inquirer, began her own investigation. She obtained the sealed 1993 settlement through legal channels and found that the state had paid $2.3 million to settle claims from 14 families without admitting wrongdoing. Those 14 families had never gotten answers about what happened to their relatives. Jennifer's article ran 6 weeks after Ryan's documentation. It was thorough, well-researched, and included excerpts from the files they'd found. It mentioned Ryan's work and included several of his photographs. The article was buried on page A7 and generated minimal response. The state police did investigate. They confirmed the presence of the files, the equipment, the evidence of recent maintenance. They interviewed Ryan's team extensively. They analyzed the notebooks and determined the handwriting belonged to multiple individuals across decades, with the most recent entries unattributable. But they never identified a suspect. The working theory presented to Ryan 8 months after his documentation was that a former employee or family member, had been periodically entering the facility to maintain records, essentially running a private archive of what had happened there. The alternative theory, that someone was actively maintaining the space for future use, couldn't be substantiated. No charges were filed. The facility was permanently sealed following the investigation. The property was sold to a developer who planned to demolish the structures and build a residential complex. But the demolition never happened. Funding fell through. Environmental concerns emerged. The property sat. Ryan completed his MFA thesis using the documentation from Maplecrest. It was well received academically. It changed nothing practically. He thinks about the 43 patients who disappeared in the facility's final 2 years. The state's investigation identified remains of 17 individuals buried on the property, none of them with proper death certificates, none of them officially recorded as having died at Maplecrest. That leaves 26 people still unaccounted for. The families of those 14 people who settled in 1993 received money, but not answers. Some of them contacted Ryan after Jennifer's article ran. They thanked him for documenting what happened. They told him it didn't bring closure, but it brought acknowledgement, which was something. Ryan's thesis is available online. The photographs are in public archives. The evidence is preserved. And somewhere, whoever wrote those entries 15 months ago is still out there. Maybe they've moved on. Maybe they found another facility. Maybe they were just documenting history. Or maybe they're waiting for the attention to die down, for the property to change hands again, for the security to lapse. Ryan doesn't know. What he knows is that he documented what he found. He reported it through proper channels, and the system responded with the minimum required action. Some stories don't end with justice. They end with evidence. And evidence, he's learned, is not the same thing as change. Savannah Moore was a criminology graduate student at Temple University, researching the psychological impact of rural isolation on personal security awareness. Her thesis advisor had connected her with Mrs. Patricia Caldwell, who'd agreed to let Savannah house sit for 10 days while she visited family in Oregon, with the understanding that Savannah would be conducting observational research on solo dwelling experiences in rural settings. It was perfect for her research. A farmhouse in Chester County, miles from neighbors, a controlled environment where Savannah could document her own psychological responses to extended isolation. She'd prepared methodically. She kept a detailed journal of her daily routines, her sleep quality, her anxiety levels, her security behaviors. She installed her own cameras in the common areas with Mrs. Caldwell's permission, small, battery-powered units that recorded to SD cards, meant to capture her movement patterns through the space. The research was about her, not about threats. That was the hypothesis. That isolation anxiety was internally generated rather than response to actual danger. She was wrong. Day 5, morning journal entry. Kitchen chair moved from tucked position to angled position. I did not sit in this chair. Possible sleepwalking. Set up camera in dining room to capture overnight movement. Day 6, morning journal entry. Bathroom door found closed this morning. Door does not self-close. Tested multiple times. Camera footage shows door open when I went to bed, closed when I woke. Camera did not capture closing event. May need to adjust angle or add second camera. Day 7, morning journal entry. Book relocated from shelf to coffee table. Cup removed from dishwasher and placed on counter. I am now documenting every object placement with photographs before bed. This is no longer about isolation anxiety. Something is wrong. On day 8, Savannah reviewed her camera footage systematically, frame by frame, looking for evidence of her own sleepwalking or gaps in the recording. She found neither, but she found something else. In the dining room camera footage from 2:47 a.m. on day 7, there was motion blur near the edge of the frame. Not Savannah, not the cats. Something moving through the room at the edge of the camera's field of view. Too quick to identify, but clearly present. She checked the kitchen camera footage from the same night. At 3:12 a.m., there was a shadow, just for 2 frames, crossing through the light coming from the hallway nightlight. Someone had been in the house while she slept. Savannah's criminology training overrode her fear just enough to keep her methodical. She didn't pack and leave immediately. She spent the day examining the house systematically, looking for entry points, hidden spaces, anything that would explain how someone could enter a locked building. She found the crawl space access in the basement. She documented everything with her phone camera before calling police. The sleeping bag, the supplies, the notebook, and then she noticed something else. A small hole drilled through the floorboards directly above the sleeping bag position, creating a sight line to the first floor. That's when she understood. This wasn't random. This was observation. She looked at the notebook more closely before the police arrived. The entries were clinical, detached. They read like research notes, like her own journal entries, actually, just focused on her instead of written by her. The crawl space was empty, but it had been occupied recently. The sleeping bag was still compressed in the shape of a body. One of the water bottles had condensation on the inside. Whoever had been living here had left recently, possibly when they heard her descending the basement stairs, possibly minutes before she found the open panel. Savannah moved. Up the basement stairs, through the kitchen, out the front door without her keys or her shoes, across the gravel driveway to her car. She got in, locked the doors, drove to the nearest gas station 3 miles away, and called 911 from the parking lot. 2 officers arrived at the property within 20 minutes. She waited in the parking lot while they cleared the house, her hands still trembling on the steering wheel. One officer came back out 40 minutes later and asked her to come look at something. The crawl space was empty. The person was gone, likely through the exterior access panel they found hidden behind overgrown landscaping at the back of the house. But everything they'd left behind remained. The officer walked Savannah through the evidence without letting her touch anything. In addition to the sleeping materials and food waste, there were Polaroid photographs, dozens of them, taken through gaps between the floorboards, showing different rooms of the house from below. The kitchen, the living room, the bedroom where Savannah slept, and the notebook. The officer wouldn't let her read it initially, but later, during her formal statement, he shared some of the contents with her. Daily entries in neat, careful handwriting, documenting her routine in clinical detail, what time she woke up, what she ate for breakfast, when she showered, what time she turned her bedroom light off, how long she sat on the back porch each afternoon. The entries covered 7 days, starting 2 days after Savannah's arrival. The first entry noted her schedule, her appearance, her routines. Whoever had been living under the house had either learned her schedule from Mrs. Caldwell or had observed her through the crawl space for those first 2 days before beginning to document systematically. The exterior crawl space panel had no lock. There were scuff marks suggesting it had been opened and closed repeatedly, but no fingerprints anywhere in the crawl space, on the panel, the notebook, the food cans, or any other surface. The photographs had been taken with an instant camera that left no digital trail. This was deliberate, careful. Someone had selected this house, observed Savannah, and spent a week doing nothing except watching and recording. Savannah called Mrs. Caldwell. Mrs. Caldwell drove back from Oregon the next day, horrified and bewildered. She had no idea anyone had access to the crawl space. No memory of the exterior panel being installed. A contractor confirmed the panel hardware was relatively new, installed within the past 5 years, likely by someone who had brief, legitimate access to the property during repairs or maintenance. The police filed a stalking report. Detectives canvassed the area, interviewed neighbors, reviewed what little security camera footage existed in the rural area. They developed a theory. The stalker was likely someone who had worked on the property, a contractor, landscaper, or utility worker who had installed the panel during legitimate work and later returned to use it. But they found nothing concrete. The handwriting in the notebook matched no one in any database. The instant camera photos couldn't be traced. No contractors who'd worked on the property in the past 5 years had criminal records or raised red flags. The Chester County Police Department took the case seriously from the start. Detective Lisa Morrison was the lead investigator, and she'd seen stalking cases before, but nothing quite like this. The level of organization is unusual, Detective Morrison told Savannah during her second interview. Most stalkers are emotionally driven. This feels more like surveillance. The police analysis of the notebook revealed that the entries had begun not 2 days after Savannah's arrival, but rather 6 months prior, with Mrs. Caldwell as the subject. The handwriting changed on day 3 of Savannah's stay, suggesting either a different observer or a deliberate change in documentation style. Mrs. Caldwell was being watched long before you arrived, Morrison explained. Whoever this was, they had access to the property for months, possibly longer. The police interviewed every contractor, service worker, and delivery person who'd had access to the property in the past 3 years. The crawl space panel had been installed during a foundation repair project 2 years earlier. The contractor had gone out of business, and the crew members had scattered to different companies. One of them, a man named Thomas Brennan, couldn't be located. His last known address was abandoned. His phone was disconnected. His employment history showed a pattern of short-term construction jobs throughout Chester, Montgomery, and Bucks counties, always residential, always in rural areas. Police obtained a warrant and searched 3 properties where Brennan had worked. They found similar crawlspace modifications at 2 of them, panels that shouldn't have been there, sight lines drilled through floorboards, but no current occupation, no notebooks, no evidence of ongoing surveillance. Thomas Brennan had vanished. Detective Morrison contacted the families who lived at those 2 properties. Both had experienced the same small anomalies Savannah had documented. Moved objects, closed doors, unexplained sounds at night. Neither had investigated thoroughly. Both had attributed it to ordinary forgetfulness or house settling. You documented it, Morrison told Savannah. You kept records. That's the only reason we know what happened. The others just lived with the weird feelings and never pursued it. Mrs. Caldwell sold the property immediately, but the 2 other families chose to stay after police sealed their crawl spaces and installed security systems. They couldn't afford to move. The case went cold within 2 months. Savannah's thesis changed direction entirely. She wrote instead about the intersection of isolation, documentation, and the detection of predatory behavior. Her committee accepted the revised focus. She testified before a Pennsylvania House committee examining residential security standards for foundation repair projects. Her testimony, along with Detective Morrison's case file, led to new regulations requiring inspection of all crawl space modifications and sealed spaces in home renovation projects. It was a small victory. Thomas Brennan was never located. A multi-county warrant remains active. His photograph is distributed to construction companies and contractor licensing boards across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. Detective Morrison believes he's still working, still installing access panels, still finding isolated properties, still observing. She's identified 4 additional properties, with suspicious crawlspace modifications across 3 counties. None have current evidence of occupation, but the pattern suggests systematic selection. He's patient, Morrison told Savannah during their final interview for her thesis. That's what makes him dangerous. He installs access, waits months or years, and only returns when the property seems ideal. We're working with state police to identify his selection criteria. Savannah graduated with honors. Her thesis is cited in security consulting literature and victim advocacy training materials. She's given 3 presentations to law enforcement groups about documentation methods for victims of stalking. She checks under floors now, not just in her own apartment, but whenever she stays anywhere overnight. She's taught a dozen friends how to identify access panels, sight lines, and signs of long-term surveillance. The notebook from the Caldwell property is retained as evidence. Savannah has never read its full contents. Detective Morrison advised against it for her own psychological well-being, but she knows what was in there. Clinical observations, detailed routines, someone studying her the way she'd been studying herself. The difference was consent. She'd chosen to observe her own behavior for research. Someone else had made that choice for her. And that violation, the removal of agency, the secret reversal of observer and observed, is what she thinks about when she teaches others to check their spaces, to document the small wrong things, to trust their instincts when something feels off. Because Thomas Brennan is still out there, and he's not the only one. Dr. Daniel Kim wasn't working alone when he began researching the Stone Ridge Trail disappearances. He was part of a 3-person team from East Stroudsburg University, conducting a multidisciplinary study on unexplained missing persons cases in Pennsylvania wilderness areas. His co-researchers were Dr. Lisa Brennan, a cultural anthropologist specializing in indigenous land use histories, and Michael Torres, a data analyst working on his master's thesis in geographic information systems. Together, they'd received a small grant to examine patterns in wilderness disappearances across the Pocono region. The project was straightforward: collect all documented cases, map them geographically, look for patterns, and assess whether improved trail signage or search protocols might reduce future incidents. What started as a safety study became something else when they plotted the data. The Stone Ridge Trail showed a cluster that defied statistical probability. 16 documented disappearances over 85 years, all in October, all within a half-mile section of trail. Michael ran the analysis 3 times, adjusting for variables like trail usage, seasonal weather, and reporting bias. The probability of the cluster occurring randomly was less than 0.02%. This isn't random, Michael told the team during their weekly meeting. Either there's an environmental hazard we're not seeing, or there's human predation, or... He didn't finish the sentence. None of them wanted to say what the data suggested. Lisa focused on the historical context. She spent 2 weeks in Lenape Community Archives and found exactly what Eleanor Marsh would later confirm. The land near the Sentinel had been used for ceremonial purposes specifically related to death rites and ancestor communication. The Lenape had specific protocols about when and how to approach the site, particularly during what they called the thin time, late autumn, when the boundary between living and dead was considered permeable. They didn't consider it cursed, Lisa explained. They considered it active, a place that required knowledge and respect to navigate safely. The trail construction in 1937 ignored all of that. Daniel interviewed descendants of missing persons. He found patterns in the accounts that hadn't made it into official reports. Multiple witnesses mentioned that the missing person had said they heard something, a call, a voice, just before stepping off the trail. In 3 cases, the missing person had specifically said they heard their own name being called. Michael mapped secondary data, cell phone signal strength, electromagnetic variations, geological fault lines. He found an unusual magnetic anomaly centered on the Sentinel outcropping, not dramatic enough to affect compasses significantly, but present and measurable. Magnetic anomalies can affect brain function, Michael explained. Temporal lobe stimulation, auditory hallucinations, disorientation. It was a rational explanation. It might have been the answer they needed, but it didn't explain why the disappearances only occurred in October. They planned the field research carefully. All 3 of them would hike the trail together on an October morning, equipped with recording equipment, electromagnetic field detectors, GPS trackers, and satellite communicators. They document environmental conditions at the Sentinel, take measurements, record audio, and stay together at all times. They notified the university, filed an expedition plan, and scheduled check-in calls. The hike started normally. They took measurements at quarter-mile intervals, documenting everything. Lisa photographed the landscape from angles that matched historical trail photos, tracking environmental changes over decades. Michael monitored the EMF readings, watching for spikes. The first anomaly appeared at the Sentinel. Michael's EMF detector spiked dramatically, far beyond the levels he'd measured during preliminary surveys. "Something's different today," he said, checking the device calibration. "This reading shouldn't be possible with this equipment." Daniel felt it then, the disorientation he'd read about in witness accounts. Not dramatic, just a subtle wrongness in his spatial awareness. The world looked correct, but felt incorrect in a way that resisted articulation. And then he heard it. Not his name, this time. Lisa's name. Clear and close, coming from the forest below the outcropping. Daniel turned toward Lisa. She'd heard it too, her own name, in a voice she couldn't quite place but somehow felt she should recognize. She took a step toward the forest edge. "Stop!" Michael grabbed her arm. "Don't. Whatever you're hearing, don't follow it." Lisa stopped, confusion clearing from her expression. "Did you both hear that?" "I heard your name," Daniel confirmed. "I heard mine," Lisa said. "In my mother's voice. But my mother's been dead for 6 years." They stood together for 30 seconds, recording everything, documenting the experience in real time. Then they walked back the way they'd come, maintaining physical contact, moving deliberately away from the Sentinel. The auditory phenomena continued for approximately 2 minutes, then ceased. Back at the university, they analyzed everything. The EMF spike was documented. The auditory phenomena was captured on their recorders, but only as their own voices describing what they'd heard. The phenomenon itself hadn't recorded. Whatever they'd experienced was perceived but not objectively measurable by their equipment. Temporal lobe stimulation from electromagnetic variation could explain subjective auditory experiences, Michael wrote in his analysis. But it doesn't explain why the effect is so specifically targeted, why people hear their names rather than random sounds. Lisa contributed the anthropological context. The Lenape protocols about this site weren't superstition. They were practical safety guidelines based on observed phenomena. They understood something dangerous was present here without understanding the mechanism. Daniel synthesized both perspectives. Whether the cause is environmental, neurological, or something we don't yet have framework to measure, the danger is real and documentable. 16 people are gone. We nearly became 17, 18, and 19. They published their findings in the Journal of Wilderness Risk Management. The paper was peer-reviewed, well-received academically, and generated exactly zero change in trail management. The Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources thanked them for their research. They conducted their own site assessment and determined the trail was safe for public use. Their assessment was a visual inspection and a review of historical maintenance records, Daniel said during a presentation at a safety conference. They didn't measure electromagnetic variations. They didn't interview descendants of missing persons. They didn't assess the documented pattern. They just looked at the trail surface and said it was fine. Daniel, Lisa, and Michael submitted formal recommendations. Close the trail during October, install warning signage about the specific danger area, require hikers to register and check in, increase search response protocols. The recommendations were acknowledged and filed. 2 months later, a 53-year-old man disappeared on the Stone Ridge Trail. October 17th, his phone was found near the Sentinel. His GPS watch showed his track terminating at the outcropping. The search effort lasted 3 weeks. Daniel, Lisa, and Michael volunteered. They walked the search grid, documented every foot of terrain, and found nothing. At the memorial service held by the family, 6 months later, Daniel spoke briefly. He explained their research, the pattern they'd documented, the warnings they'd issued. "We gave them evidence," he said. "We gave them data. We gave them recommendations that might have prevented this. And the system responded by doing nothing." The Stone Ridge Trail remains open. Warning signs were eventually installed after the 2019 disappearance, but they reference only steep terrain and unstable rock formations. Daniel, Lisa, and Michael continue their work. They've expanded their research to other trails with similar patterns. 3 additional sites in Pennsylvania, 2 in West Virginia, 1 in upstate New York. All show cluster patterns of October disappearances. All are associated with indigenous ceremonial sites. All remain open to public use. They founded a non-profit organization called Wilderness Pattern Research that advocates for evidence-based trail management and publishes open access data on wilderness disappearance clusters. They testify at state legislative hearings. They consult with families of missing persons. They train search and rescue teams on pattern recognition. The work is frustrating. The resistance to their findings is institutional and deeply rooted. Trail closures impact local economies. Acknowledging patterns raises liability questions. It's easier for agencies to treat each disappearance as an isolated incident than to address systemic dangers. But they continue, because 17 documented people have disappeared from the Stone Ridge Trail across 85 years. And the only thing preventing it from becoming 18, 19, 20 is awareness. The trail is still there. The danger is still there. The pattern continues. But now, there's documentation. There's evidence. There's a research team that refuses to let the pattern be forgotten. And every October, they monitor the news from Monroe County, waiting to see if the warnings were enough this year, or if the count will increase again. Abigail Chen wasn't researching the hex alone. She'd hired a professional genealogist, Margaret Weaver, who specialized in Pennsylvania Dutch family histories, to help her trace her maternal line back through Lancaster County for a family documentary project she was producing. The documentary was meant to be simple: connect with her roots, interview elderly relatives, document family traditions, and compile the Chen family history into something her future children could understand. Margaret had done dozens of these projects. She knew the archives, knew the communities, knew how to navigate the complex relationship between outsider researchers and insular Pennsylvania Dutch families. But 3 weeks into the research, Margaret called Abigail with an unusual question. Did your family ever mention the Houseman connection? Abigail hadn't. She'd never heard the name. Your great-great-grandmother was a houseman before marriage, Margaret explained. The genealogy shows a clear line, but I'm finding something unusual in the records. A lot of early deaths in that family line, going back to the 1820s. And there's a reference in a community history book to something called the Weber matter. I think you should look at this before we go further. Abigail and Margaret met at the Lancaster County Historical Society. Margaret had prepared a research packet, copies of birth records, death certificates, family trees, and one particularly interesting document. Minutes from an 1817 community tribunal. Clara Weber, Margaret said, pointing to the name in the tribunal record. Healer, herbalist, accused of causing harm through her remedies, banished from the community. The Housemans led the accusation. Abigail skimmed the document. This is my ancestors' family. They kicked out a healer. And then every generation of Housemans after that experienced at least one early death or major catastrophe. Look. Margaret spread out the family tree. 1841, son drowns. 1867, daughter dies in childbirth. 1903, house fire. 1924, farming accident. It continues right up to recent decades. Abigail looked at the pattern. That's terrible, but that's just normal misfortune for a farming family over 200 years, right? People died young back then. Margaret nodded slowly. That's what I thought. But then I found this. She pulled out a photocopy of a letter dated 1923, written in the German dialect, with English translation attached. It was from one houseman cousin to another, discussing the family burden and the necessity of transference, and warnings about curious outsiders. There's a belief system here, Margaret said carefully. A shared understanding that something happened in 1817 that created a pattern, and that pattern can be passed on. Abigail was a marketing director. She understood how narratives worked, how belief systems perpetuated, how superstition could survive for generations if no one questioned it. So, let me understand this, she said. My ancestors believed they were cursed because they kicked out a healer, and that belief got passed down for 200 years. And every time something bad happened, which happens to everyone, they saw it as proof of the curse. Essentially, yes, Margaret confirmed. But here's what's interesting from a research perspective. The belief system includes a transmission mechanism. The curse allegedly passes to anyone who becomes too curious about it, who asks too many questions. Abigail laughed. That's brilliant. It's a self-perpetuating narrative. Anyone who investigates becomes part of the story, which reinforces the belief for everyone else. Margaret wasn't laughing. Abigail, I need to tell you something. I've researched 12 Pennsylvania Dutch families with similar curse narratives. 3 of them had mechanisms like this, transmission through curiosity, and in 2 of those cases, the genealogist who researched the family experienced significant misfortune afterward. Coincidence, Abigail said. Probably, Margaret agreed. But I want you to understand what we're walking into. If we continue this research and then documentary, you'll be asking questions in a community that believes those questions are dangerous. And if anything bad happens to you afterward, and statistically, something bad will happen eventually, people will see it as confirmation. So we stop researching? Abigail asked. No, Margaret said. We document everything. We approach this as social anthropology, not family history. We study the belief system itself, how it's maintained, why it persists, and we're very careful about how we present this in your documentary. Over the next 6 weeks, Abigail and Margaret conducted extensive interviews with Lancaster County community members, always working in pairs, always recording everything, always framing their questions in academic terms. They spoke with Samuel and Ruth, the elderly couple Abigail had originally planned to stay with. Samuel was uncomfortable, but Ruth was willing to explain the belief system in detail, not as something she believed was literally true, but as something the community understood as true. It's like asking if I believe in the Sabbath, Ruth explained. Belief isn't the right word. It's a framework. It's how we understand certain patterns. They interviewed Hannah, the elderly woman who performed cleansing rituals. Hannah was more direct. I do what people need me to do. If they believe a ritual will help them, then performing the ritual helps them. That's not magic. That's psychology. They documented everything. The historical records, the family trees, the pattern of misfortunes, which, when compared to control groups of non-houseman families, showed no statistical difference. The transmission beliefs, the community responses. Abigail began editing the documentary with a clear narrative. This was a study of how belief systems perpetuate across generations, how communities create meaning through shared narratives, and how curse beliefs function as social control mechanisms. 3 months after beginning the project, Abigail's company lost a major client due to a contract error. She reviewed the file and found the mistake had been there for months, something she'd approved during a period when she was distracted by her mother's health issues. Margaret called her that evening. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Abigail said. "It's frustrating, but it's my mistake. I was overwhelmed with the documentary and my mom's medical stuff, and I didn't catch the error." "I'm documenting this," Margaret said, "not because I think it's connected, but because if we're going to study how these beliefs perpetuate, we need to document how confirmation bias works." They documented everything that happened to Abigail over the following months. The car accident, rear-ended at a stoplight by an uninsured driver. Police report documented the other driver was texting. The health issues. Blood work eventually revealed vitamin D deficiency and anemia from irregular eating during high-stress documentary production. Every misfortune had a rational explanation. Every explanation was documented. "Here's what's interesting," Margaret said during one of their analysis sessions. "If you weren't documenting this, if you were just experiencing these events after researching a curse, you'd see them as proof. You'd look for patterns instead of explanations." That's the mechanism, Abigail realized. The curse perpetuates because nobody documents the base rate. Nobody tracks how often these things happen to people who didn't research the curse. Abigail completed the documentary, The Houseman Narrative, How Curse Beliefs Persist in Pennsylvania Dutch Communities. It was 40 minutes long, academically rigorous, and respectful to the community, while clearly framing the curse as a social phenomenon rather than a supernatural one. She screened it at a small film festival in Philadelphia. Margaret presented their research at a folklore studies conference. They received positive responses from academics and documentary enthusiasts. The Lancaster County community response was mixed. Some community members thanked her for documenting their history with respect. Others felt she'd dismissed something important by treating it as purely psychological. Several younger community members contacted her to say the documentary helped them understand family stories they'd grown up with. And 3 community members told her, in various ways, that she'd made a mistake. "You asked the questions. one elderly man said after a screening. You documented everything, but you didn't protect yourself. From what? Abigail asked. From believing you understand something just because you can explain it. The documentary won a regional award for ethnographic filmmaking. Margaret co-authored a paper with Abigail on curse belief transmission mechanisms that was published in the Journal of American Folklore. Abigail's misfortunes continued at a statistically normal rate. She documented all of them. She found rational explanations for all of them. She compared her misfortune frequency to matched control groups and found no significant difference. The data said she wasn't cursed, but data doesn't account for awareness. She thinks about the hex differently now, not as a supernatural force, but as a cognitive trap. Once you're told to look for a pattern, you see it everywhere. Once you're told you're cursed, every normal misfortune becomes evidence. Once you're part of the narrative has power over you, regardless of whether it's objectively true. The hex is real, she wrote in her research notes, not because Clara Weber had supernatural power, but because belief in the hex changes behavior. People who think they're cursed become hypervigilant about misfortune, which increases their stress, which increases their likelihood of making mistakes, which creates more misfortune, which confirms the belief. It's a closed loop. Understanding the mechanism didn't free her from it. She still counts her misfortunes, still wonders if the car accident, or the health issues, or the work problems would have happened if she hadn't researched the Houseman family. Still catches herself thinking, is this because of, before remembering that causation doesn't work that way. Margaret tells her it will fade with time, that the hypervigilance will decrease, that she'll eventually process this as an interesting research project rather than a personal burden. Abigail hopes she's right, but sometimes, when someone asks about her documentary project, about Lancaster County, about Pennsylvania Dutch traditions, she feels the pull, not a supernatural compulsion, just the very human desire to share a burden that feels too heavy to carry alone, and she understands then how it perpetuates. Not through magic, through communication, through the human need to explain our suffering and to feel less alone in it. She hasn't told anyone the full story outside academic contexts, but the temptation exists every day, not because she's cursed, but because she's human.